Her hand shot out and closed around the small gray device hanging from my son's neck, and she yanked it so hard the strap snapped against his throat. And Tyler didn't scream because Tyler can't scream. He just opened his mouth and nothing came out, the way it never does, and that silence was louder than anything I have ever heard in my life. I need to take you back to how this all started. Because what she didn't know, what none of them knew, not the flight attendants standing frozen in the aisle, not the man in seat 14C already lifting his phone to record, not even my own son who was too busy trying to breathe through the panic, was exactly who she had just put her hands on. Not just my son, me. And she was about to learn that lesson in front of 183 witnesses at 37,000 feet, with absolutely nowhere to run. My name is Rachel Donovan, and 3 years ago I would have told you I was just a mom from Charlotte, North Carolina, who drank her coffee black and folded laundry at 11 at night, and drove a 10-year-old Honda Pilot with a cracked cup holder and a booster seat that never quite sat straight no matter how many times I reinstalled it. That part was always true. What I didn't advertise, what I kept folded up small like a letter I carried in my back pocket, was the other part of my life. The part where I left the house some mornings in a suit instead of yoga pants, where my badge sat in a locked drawer instead of my purse, where the people who worked for me called me Director instead of Rachel. In my line of work, I had learned to stay very still and very calm in situations that would send most people running for the exits. I had negotiated with people who wanted to hurt a lot more than a 7-year-old's feelings. But nothing had ever prepared me for watching someone go after my son. Tyler was born perfect and loud, screaming his way into the world at Presbyterian Hospital on a Tuesday in October, 7 pounds 2 ounces, and for the first 14 months of his life he babbled and laughed and said, "Mama." So many times my husband used to joke he was training to run for office. He said "Dada too" and "dog," and more, pointing at his high chair tray with the kind of delighted insistence only a toddler can manage. We have videos of it still, saved in 3 different places because I am terrified, in some quiet unspoken part of myself, of ever losing them. Then came the fever. 104, then 105, spiking in the middle of the night while my husband Mark and I took turns pressing cool washcloths to his forehead and telling ourselves it was just a virus, kids get fevers, this is normal, this is fine. Then came the seizure, his small body locking rigid in my arms in the back seat of the car on the way to the emergency room. My own voice screaming things I don't fully remember screaming. Then came 11 days in the PICU at Levine Children's Hospital, 11 days of monitors and specialists and a rotating cast of doctors using words like encephalopathy and acute neurological insult, while I sat in a plastic chair that never got comfortable no matter how I turned it, holding Tyler's tiny hand through the bars of a hospital crib. And then came a diagnosis that rearranged our entire universe. A rare form of childhood apraxia layered on top of a neurological injury that meant my son, my brilliant, funny, endlessly curious little boy, would likely never speak in full sentences again. He understood everything. He felt everything. He just couldn't get the words out of his mouth and into the air, and no amount of therapy, no amount of exercises with tongue depressors and mirrors and flashcards was ever going to fully change that. I remember the exact moment the developmental pediatrician told us. Dr. Aluwalia, kind eyes, folded hands, a box of tissues already positioned on the desk between us like she'd learned the hard way to have it ready. He is going to be an intelligent, capable, emotionally rich human being, she told us. But his mouth and his brain are not going to reliably agree with each other. We need to give him another way to talk. That was the day the word AC entered our lives, augmentative and alternative communication, and the day Miss Angela, his speech therapist, became one of the most important people either of us had ever met. I should tell you a little more about who I was before all of this, because it matters for what comes later. I joined the Bureau at 26, fresh out of a law degree I'd only half wanted, more interested in the psychology electives than the contract law, and I spent my first 6 years working financial crimes out of the Charlotte field office, the kind of cases that involve spreadsheets more than car chases, elderly victims more than gunfights. I was good at it. I was good at the specific, unglamorous work of sitting across a table from someone who has spent years building an elaborate lie and quietly, patiently, taking that lie apart one thread at a time until there's nothing left for them to stand on. Somewhere in there, I discovered I had a gift for staying calm when the person across from me wanted, more than anything, for me to lose my composure. The angrier they got, the quieter I got. It unsettled people. It still does. By the time Tyler was born, I had moved into a supervisory role, and by the time he was diagnosed, I was traveling more, testifying more, sitting in rooms with more stars on the wall than I ever expected to see in my career. Mark, my husband, used to tease me that I brought my interview voice home sometimes without meaning to. That same flat, patient, unshakable tone I used on suspects who thought they could outlast me. I told him I hoped I never needed to use it on anyone who mattered to us. I was wrong about that, as it turned out, though not in the way either of us could have predicted. What none of that career prepared me for, though, was watching my son learn to live in a body that wouldn't let him speak the way other kids could. There is no negotiation training for that. There is no interrogation room technique for sitting beside a crib at 2 in the morning while your son tries, over and over, to form a word his mouth simply will not make, his frustration mounting until he cries from the sheer effort of it. And all you can do is hold him and tell him it's okay, even though some nights you don't fully believe it yourself. 3 specific things about Tyler that you need to know before I tell you what happened on that plane, because I want you to know him the way I know him, not the way she saw him. He collects rocks. Not for any particular reason, just because he likes how they feel in his palm, and he has a system for sorting them by weight that makes sense only to him, lined up on his windowsill in an order he rearranges constantly and defends fiercely if anyone touches it. He hums when he's happy. This low, steady sound that vibrates through his chest like a little engine. And it's the sound I have built my entire adult life around protecting. And he has the most enormous, gap-toothed, unguarded smile I have ever seen on a human being. The kind of smile that makes strangers in grocery stores stop what they're doing just to smile back. The kind that makes cashiers slip him extra stickers and makes old men in diners wave from across the room. Miss Angela came into our lives when Tyler was 2.5. A soft-spoken speech-language pathologist with a caseload of 40 kids and somehow still enough patience left over to answer my panicked emails at 9 o'clock at night. She was the one who first introduced us to the world of AAC devices, sitting cross-legged on our living room floor demonstrating a loaner tablet while Tyler watched with the wary suspicion toddlers reserve for anything new. It took him almost 3 weeks before he pressed his first button on purpose. A picture of a dog that made the tablet say dog in a flat, unfamiliar computer voice, and I remember the way his whole face lit up at the realization that the machine had done exactly what he wanted it to do. That was the beginning of everything. Over the following 5 years, Miss Angela and Tyler built out that vocabulary page by page, category by category, arguing sometimes, in the specific patient way a 4-year-old argues with his therapist, over which words mattered enough to earn a spot on the home screen. Dinosaurs made the cut early. So did his own name for his stuffed rabbit, a word that doesn't exist anywhere else in the English language and that only Miss Angela and I have ever fully understood. His communication device, the one she grabbed, was not a toy. It was a speech-generating tablet loaded with software that had taken Miss Angela 11 months to fully customize, with Tyler's own vocabulary, his own jokes, his own way of saying, "I love you, Mama," in exactly the cadence he wanted it said, a little rising lilt at the end that he'd insisted on programming himself, pointing and pointing at the settings screen until Miss Angela understood what he wanted. Cost more than my first car. But that wasn't why it mattered. It mattered because it was his voice, the only one he had. Every joke he'd ever get to make, every question he'd ever get to ask, every "I love you" he'd ever get to say out loud instead of just feeling it trapped behind his teeth. All of it lived inside that cracked plastic case. Tyler's daily life, in case you're picturing something sadder than it actually is mostly ordinary. He goes to a public elementary school in South Charlotte with a wonderful inclusion classroom and a paraprofessional named Ms. Ruiz who has learned his device inside and out. He has 2 best friends, Marcus and Owen, neither of whom has ever once seemed to notice that Tyler talks differently than they do, because 7-year-olds, it turns out, are far more adaptable than most adults ever give them credit for. He loves dinosaurs, specifically the Parasaurolophus, which he can identify from a picture faster than I can pronounce it. He is, in every meaningful sense, just a kid who happens to carry his voice around his neck instead of keeping it in his throat. We were flying from Charlotte to Denver so Tyler could finally meet his grandfather, my dad, who had just been moved into hospice care after a long fight with pancreatic cancer. Tyler had never met him in person. Just video calls, pixelated and glitching. My father's thin hand waving at a screen. My father's voice, weaker every month, saying, "There's my favorite guy," through a laptop speaker that made everything sound tinny and far away. This was supposed to be the trip where that finally changed. Tyler had spent the whole morning humming while he packed his rock collection into a Ziploc bag for Grandpa, carefully selecting which ones to bring, holding each one up to the light like he was choosing gifts for a king. When we boarded the plane, he pressed a button on his device and it played, in his careful robotic but somehow still him voice. "I am so happy today." He was so happy. And then she sat down in 12A. She rolled her carry-on into the aisle like it owed her money, cutting off an elderly man trying to stow his cane, not even glancing back at him as he steadied himself against the overhead bins. She wore the kind of athleisure that costs for $100 and is worn specifically so people know it costs for $100. Matching set, blonde hair pulled back so tight it looked like it physically hurt her scalp, oversized sunglasses pushed up on her head even though we were nowhere near sunlight. She looked at our row, 12B and 12C, Tyler by the window, me on the aisle, like we were a stain she'd found on a hotel bedspread, something to be reported to management rather than simply lived with. Before she even sat down, she said, loud enough for half the cabin to hear, addressing no one and everyone at once. "I specifically requested a quiet row. I have a migraine condition and I cannot be around noise." A flight attendant nearby, a young woman with a name tag that read Priya, offered to check whether another seat might be available, and she waved her off with the particular impatience of someone who has never once in her life been told no and meant it. I told her, calmly, that my son was quiet, that he had a speech device but he wasn't going to be shouting or crying, that we'd try to keep things easy for everyone. She looked at Tyler like he'd personally insulted her ancestors, her eyes sweeping over him the way you'd survey a stain on a rug. "Is something wrong with him?" she asked, not lowering her voice at all, and I felt Tyler's small body go still beside me the way it does when he understands he's being talked about like he isn't there. That particular stillness of a child who has learned, far too young, what it feels like to be discussed instead of addressed. One brief flash of something almost human crossed her face right then. A flicker, barely a second, like maybe some old buried decency was trying to surface. A small softening around her eyes that made me think, for one hopeful second, of someone's mother or someone's sister. Someone who had once been a child herself and understood what it meant to be small and misunderstood in the world. I actually let myself believe, for that one heartbeat, that we were going to be fine. Then the flight attendant walked by again, and she flagged her down and said, in the sweetest, fakest voice I have ever heard a grown woman produce, "I just want to make sure there won't be any disruptive noises back here. Some of us paid for first class for a reason. We were not in first class. We were in economy plus, same as her." A detail she either didn't know or didn't care was easily disprovable, and I watched that flicker of humanity disappear completely, replaced by something colder and much more familiar to anyone who has ever dealt with a person who has decided the rules exist for other people, not for them. I want to describe her a little more fully now, not because she deserves the attention, but because the specific texture of a person like her matters if you want to understand how these situations happen in the first place. She was not a cartoon villain when she boarded that plane. She looked, if anything, like someone you'd see at a nice grocery store on a Tuesday morning, unremarkable in the way that people who have never once faced real consequences often are, moving through the world with the particular ease of someone who has learned that most people will simply absorb whatever discomfort she creates rather than confront her about it. She had the posture of someone perpetually annoyed by a world that was, in her mind, constantly failing to meet her standards. She checked her phone 4 times before we'd even finished boarding, sighing each time at something on the screen, and she reorganized the items in her seat back pocket with the brisk irritation of someone convinced the previous occupant of the seat had personally wronged her by existing there first. For the first hour, it was nothing but sighs. Loud, theatrical, pointed sighs every time Tyler pressed a button on his device. Even when the volume was so low I could barely hear it myself over the engine hum. She kept glancing over with this tight, performative wince, one hand pressed dramatically to her temple, like she was suffering nobly in front of a jury only she could see. I kept my voice low and even. I told her we'd keep the volume down as much as possible, that he needed the device to communicate, that there wasn't really an alternative, that this was simply how my son talked to the world. She told me, and I am quoting this exactly because I will never forget it as long as I live, maybe he should learn to just point at things like a normal kid. A woman too rose up, turned around at that, her mouth falling open slightly. A man in a Carolina Panthers cap muttered something under his breath that sounded a lot like, Unbelievable. The flight attendant, a young man named Marcus, came by and gently, professionally, asked if everything was okay back here, and she smiled up at him with a warmth that didn't reach her eyes and said everything was fine, just a little loud, and he moved on because there was nothing yet to actually act on. That's how these things work. That's how she got away with it so many times before. I could tell by the practiced ease of her outrage, the way she escalated in stages like she'd done this exact routine 100 times on 100 flights, always finding some tired parent or exhausted caregiver too worn down to push back. This was not her first flight. This was her method, refined over years of small victories against people too depleted to fight back. Somewhere over Kentucky, the beverage cart came through, and she ordered a glass of wine and then complained it wasn't cold enough, sending it back with a sigh so heavy it seemed to take real physical effort. Tyler got hungry and reached for his snack bag, and his elbow bumped her armrest by accident, barely a graze, and she yanked her arm back like he'd burned her, actually recoiling in her seat. "Can you control him?" she snapped, loud enough that 3 rows turned around. I told her, still calm, still even, that it was an accident, that he was 7, that these things happen on planes, that I was sorry, that we could switch the tray table position if it would help. "Well, maybe he shouldn't be on planes," she said. And there it was, the line most people don't cross. She'd just told my mute, cancer-stricken grandfather visiting, 7-year-old son that he didn't belong on an airplane, in front of a cabin full of strangers, because his existence inconvenienced her. I want you to sit with that for a second, because what she didn't understand, what she couldn't possibly have known, was that I had spent the last decade of my career sitting across tables from people who had done far worse than say cruel things to a child, and I had learned that the most dangerous thing in the world is not a person who's screaming. It's a person who's gone quiet. And I could feel myself going quiet. Tyler's hum, that low steady sound I love more than almost any other sound in the universe, started to waver. It got higher, thinner, the way it does right before he gets overwhelmed, a sound I have learned to recognize the way other mothers recognize the specific cry that means their baby is hungry versus tired versus in pain. He pressed a button on his device. "I am scared." And his voice, his careful, customized 11 months in the making voice, played out into the cabin at a volume of maybe 2 out of 10. I reached over and squeezed his hand, and I told him quietly, "You're okay, buddy. I'm right here." She turned in her seat at the sound, her face twisting into something sharp. "Oh my God," she said, to the man beside her in 12A's neighbor seat, loud enough for the words to carry. "This is exactly what I was afraid of." And then she reached across the aisle, right past my body, and grabbed the device off his neck strap. That's the moment. That's where I started this story. Her hand closing around it, the strap snapping against his throat, his mouth opening on a scream that physically cannot come out of him, and 183 strangers about to find out exactly what happens when you put your hands on the wrong 7-year-old boy in front of the wrong mother in the world. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was exactly who she had just made the biggest mistake of her life against. For 1 full second, I didn't move. I want to be honest with you about that, because this isn't a story about a superhero, it's a story about a mother. And in that first second, every instinct I had was pure animal terror, the kind that has nothing to do with training or badges or 14 years in federal law enforcement. It's the kind every parent understands the instant it happens. The world narrowing down to one single point, your child's face, your child's fear, and everything else falling away like it was never real to begin with. I could hear my own pulse in my ears. I could feel the plastic armrest under my palm, digging in where I'd gripped it without realizing. Then the second passed and something else took over. Something quieter. Something that had been trained into me across more than a decade of hostage negotiations, financial fraud task forces, and 2 different congressional hearings where men twice my age tried to rattle me and failed. I reached over, gently but with absolute certainty, and closed my hand around her wrist. Not hard, not violent, just immovable, the way you'd hold the wrist of someone about to do something they could never take back. "You need to let go of that device right now," I said. My voice did not rise. That was the strange thing bystanders would talk about later, when this story made its way around the internet. How quiet I stayed the entire time, how the quiet felt worse than shouting ever could have. She yanked her hand back like I'd shocked her, the device still gripped in her fingers, and Tyler was making this sound now, this awful thin keening sound that was the closest thing to crying that his vocal cords could manage, and I have never in my adult life wanted so badly to simply lose control. I did not. I have spent years training myself not to. Instead, I held out my hand, palm up, steady, and said, "Give him back his voice." She looked at me like I'd said something absurd. "It's just a toy," she said, loud enough for the row behind us to hear, loud enough that I saw the elderly man across the aisle actually flinch. Maybe if he had an actual voice, this wouldn't be an issue. The cabin went cold. I felt it happen, that specific shift in air pressure that occurs when 40 strangers simultaneously decide someone has crossed a line there's no walking back from. A woman in 11C, gray-haired, sturdy, the kind of woman who looked like she'd raised 4 kids and buried 2 husbands and wasn't afraid of anybody, turned fully around in her seat, her reading glasses sliding down her nose. "Ma'am," she said, in an accent thick with the Carolinas, "you give that baby back his machine right now or I will come back there myself, and you will not enjoy that conversation." Marcus, the flight attendant, arrived within seconds, alerted by the commotion, moving faster down the aisle than the standard beverage cart pace, and I watched him take in the scene. My son's neck with a red mark where the strap had snapped against it, the device in her hand, my own carefully controlled stillness, and something shifted in his face too. He asked her, professionally but firmly, to return the item immediately. She held it against her chest like a shield, arms crossed over it. "This is assault," she said, pointing at me. She grabbed my wrist. "I want that written up. I want her arrested when we land." I said nothing. I have found, across the years, that silence in these moments does more work than any argument ever could. I simply held my hand out again, waiting, and Tyler pressed himself into my side, his small body shaking, and I felt something in my chest go very cold and very still. The specific stillness I remembered from exactly one other moment in my career, a moment I don't talk about, a moment where I learned that calm is not the absence of rage. Calm is rage that has found its target and is waiting. A man near the back. New York accent, unmistakable. The kind of voice that cuts through engine noise without even trying, called out, "Lady, just give the kid his thing back. What is wrong with you?" And she wheeled around to face him, and for the first time I saw something crack in her performance, a flicker of uncertainty at just how many people were now watching her. By this point, nearly every row within earshot had turned to watch, the specific quiet of a cabin collectively holding its breath settling over rows 10 through 14. A young woman in 13A, headphones around her neck instead of over her ears, had her phone raised, not filming yet, just ready, the way you hold a phone when you sense something is about to happen that you'll want a record of. An older man across the aisle in 12D, who had said nothing the entire flight, set down the paperback he'd been reading, folded the corner of the page and simply watched, his expression unreadable but his attention absolute. Even the flight attendants working the forward galley had gone still, the rhythmic clinking of the beverage cart pausing entirely as Priya stood frozen near the curtain, watching the scene unfold with her hand pressed flat against her chest. "He needs to learn boundaries," she said. Weaker this time, quieter, testing whether the cabin was still on her side. It wasn't. A younger man, maybe 30, soft Midwestern voice, said from 2 rows back, "Ma'am, he's a little kid with a disability. Please, just give it back." And I watched her calculate, watched her run whatever internal math people like her run when they realize the audience has stopped applauding. She threw the device onto my lap. Not handed. Threw. It landed hard enough that I heard something inside it click, a sound that made my stomach drop, because that device held 11 months of a therapist's work and every single word my son had ever learned to say through it. "There," she snapped. "Are you happy now? Maybe next time keep him at home." I did not answer her. I turned to Tyler instead, cupping his face in both hands, feeling his whole body trembling, and I said the only thing that mattered in that moment. "I've got you, baby. I've got you. You're safe." He pressed the device against his chest, the cracked screen flickering, and I watched him try over and over to get it to respond, his small fingers stabbing at buttons that used to light up instantly and now stuttered and lagged, and it wouldn't fully work, and something in me finished breaking in a way I hadn't expected. There is a specific sound a child makes when they are trying to speak and the machine that gives them their voice simply will not cooperate. A small, frustrated huff of breath through the nose, over and over, each one a little more desperate than the last. And I will carry that sound with me for the rest of my life the same way I carry the memory of his first seizure, The same way I carry the memory of Dr. Aluwalia's voice delivering his diagnosis. Tyler pressed the same cracked button 9 times in a row. I counted them without meaning to, my whole body counting them the way you count contractions or count breaths during a panic attack, some animal part of my brain needing to measure exactly how much pain was happening in real time. On the 9th press, something inside the device gave a small defeated click and went completely dark, and Tyler looked up at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Not fear exactly, something closer to a very small, very young kind of grief. I want to tell you honestly, this is the one moment in the entire story where I cried, and I am not ashamed of it. Not from fear, and not even entirely from anger. From the specific grief of watching your child reach for his only voice and find it silent. Marcus crouched down beside our row and asked gently if we needed medical assistance, if Tyler was physically hurt, and I told him the mark on his neck needed to be documented, that I needed his name and the names of every crew member who witnessed this, and something in the way I said it, precise, procedural, unmistakably practiced, made him pause and look at me differently than he had 30 seconds earlier. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "can I ask what you do for work?" I looked up at him, and for the first time since we'd boarded, I let a very small piece of the truth slip out into the open air of that cabin. "I work for the federal government," I said, "and I'd like the captain notified that a minor was assaulted on this flight." I watched the word land on him like a stone dropped into still water. He excused himself immediately and walked toward the cockpit, faster than a man walks when nothing is wrong, and I saw her. I'll admit, I still thought of her only as her, the woman, this passenger, my seatmate's neighbor, the entitled stranger who had ruined my son's afternoon. Watch him go with the first real flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. But she recovered fast, the way people like her always do, mistaking any silence for the fight being over. She settled back into her seat, arms crossed, chin lifted, already composing her version of events for whoever she planned to complain to later, and she said to no one in particular, loud enough for the row to hear, "Some people should really learn how to control their children in public." What she didn't understand yet was that Marcus wasn't walking to the cockpit to file a noise complaint against us. He was walking to the cockpit because 30 seconds earlier, I had quietly shown him a federal credential that most flight crews are trained to recognize on sight, and the captain of that aircraft was about to become the second person on this flight to understand exactly whose son had just had his only voice ripped away from his neck at 37,000 feet, with absolutely no idea what was coming for her. There is a version of this story where I stop right here and tell you it was simple after that. It wasn't. There were still almost 90 minutes of flight left, and in those 90 minutes she found 3 more ways to make things worse before she found out exactly how much worse things were about to get for her. The first came about 20 minutes later, when Priya came through with the snack service and offered Tyler a small bag of pretzels. Leaning down to smile at him, the way flight attendants do with kids, warm and automatic. Tyler, still shaken, still trying to get his stuttering device to respond, didn't reach for it right away, and she, watching this exchange from across the aisle with her arms still crossed, muttered just loud enough for me to hear, "Of course he gets special treatment. Must be nice." I didn't respond. I simply thanked Priya, took the pretzels for Tyler, and continued trying to coax his device back to functioning, my fingers finding the small reset switch on its side that Miss Angela had shown me for exactly this kind of emergency. The second came when the captain's descent announcement was still 40 minutes away, and she flagged Marcus down again, this time to complain that the air vent above her seat wasn't blowing hard enough, and when he adjusted it for her, she added, almost as an afterthought, gesturing vaguely at our row, "And can you do something about them? I really don't think it's fair that the rest of us have to deal with this the entire flight." Marcus, to his credit, told her simply that the family was doing everything they reasonably could and that he'd appreciate her patience, and I watched her face flash with the particular offense of someone and used to being told no by service staff. The third came when Tyler, finally managing to get one button on his device to respond through the crack running diagonally across the screen, pressed it to say something he says often, something that had nothing to do with her at all. "Can I have water, please?" And the volume glitched, spiking suddenly loud for half a second before cutting out, a jarring electronic stutter that made several nearby passengers jump. She whipped around so fast her sunglasses slid off the top of her head and clattered onto her tray table. "Are you kidding me?" she said, loud, sharp, final. This is exactly the kind of thing I specifically told them I couldn't deal with. I have a legitimate medical condition and nobody on this plane seems to care. That was when the gray-haired woman in 11C, whose name I would later learn was Deborah, unbuckled her seatbelt despite the sign still being off, walked the 3 rows back to stand in the aisle beside our seats, and said, calm as anything, "Ma'am, I've sat here and listened to you for the better part of an hour, and I am going to say this once. That is a broken little boy's broken machine making a broken sound because you broke it. If your head hurts, I've got Tylenol in my bag and I will gladly hand it to you. But you do not get to sit there and act like the victim of a 7-year-old for one more second of this flight." A small ripple of applause actually moved through the surrounding rows at that, quiet, restrained, the sound of an audience that has been holding something in for a long time finally allowed to exhale. She opened her mouth to respond and then, for the first time all flight, seemed to think better of it, some flicker of self-preservation finally overriding the entitlement, and she said nothing at all, turning to stare out the window instead, jaw tight, cheeks flushed with something between fury and the first real seed of fear. I used those quiet minutes to focus entirely on Tyler. I held the device in my lap, carefully working the reset switch, whispering to him the whole time, "It's okay. Baby, mommy's got it, we're gonna fix it, we're almost to grandpa's." And slowly, the screen flickered back to something closer to normal, the crack still spidering across the corner but the software responding again. Tyler pressed a button, testing it, cautious, like he wasn't sure he trusted it anymore. And it played, quiet and careful, "Thank you, Mama." I had to press my lips together hard to keep from falling apart right there in seat 12B. For the next several minutes, I went almost completely silent, and I want you to understand that this silence was not defeat. It was the loudest thing I have ever done in my life. I held Tyler against my side, I gently pressed the buttons on his device hoping it would keep responding, and when it mostly did, I simply held his hand and let him feel, through touch, what his voice couldn't fully say for him right now. That his mother was not going anywhere, that this was being handled, that the world was about to rebalance itself in a way he couldn't yet imagine. Marcus returned from the cockpit not walking, but almost gliding, the practiced calm of someone who has just been given very specific instructions. He crouched by our row again, spoke to me in a low voice that the rest of the cabin couldn't quite catch, and I watched something pass between the flight attendants near the galley. A look, a small nod, the universal body language of professionals suddenly aware they are standing inside a situation much bigger than a noise complaint. She noticed none of it. She was too busy narrating her own victimhood to the man beside her in 12A's neighbor seat. Something about how she just wanted a peaceful flight, and how some people bring their whole circus onto a plane and expect everyone else to just deal with it. Her voice had climbed back to its full theatrical register now, buoyed by what she mistook for silence meaning surrender. "I mean, honestly," she continued, loud enough for half the cabin, "I hope they at least fine her for that device thing. That's assault, what she did to my wrist. I have a good mind to call my lawyer the second we land." A ripple of quiet disbelief moved through the rows around us. Deborah, still standing nearby, actually laughed out loud, a short, sharp, disbelieving sound. "Lady," she said, "you took a disabled child's speaking machine off his neck. I don't think a lawyer's gonna help you." She waved a hand dismissively. "It's a toy. He'll get another one. Kids break things all the time." I felt Tyler flinch beside me at the word toy, and I made a promise to myself in that exact second, the kind of promise you make quietly and mean completely. She was about to learn, in real and specific terms, exactly how expensive that toy actually was, and exactly whose family she had decided to attach that carelessness to. The captain's voice came over the intercom a few minutes later, calm, professional, giving no outward indication of anything unusual. A standard update on our descent into Denver. Expected turbulence, seatbelt signs. But I noticed, and so did the flight attendants near us, that his tone carried a specific formality he hadn't used earlier in the flight, the tone of a man who has just been given information he's choosing not to broadcast yet. She, of course, heard none of that undertone. She heard only a captain's voice doing captain things, and she settled deeper into her seat, smug in the particular way of someone who believes they have gotten away with something. She even leaned toward me at one point, her voice dropped into something almost conspiratorial, almost kind, the tone people use when they think the danger has passed. "Look," she said, "I'm sorry if I came off harsh. I just really can't handle noise. Migraines are no joke. It wasn't an apology. It was a performance of one, designed for the audience she still believed was watching her sympathetically. I said nothing. I simply looked at her, steady and unreadable, and I watched the first genuine flicker of unease cross her face. Not because of anything I'd said, but because of what I hadn't. What she didn't understand, what none of them fully understood yet, not even Marcus, not even the captain who had only been given half the story, was that in exactly 11 minutes, this entire cabin was going to watch the quietest woman on this flight reveal something that would make every single person seated near row 12 remember this moment for the rest of their lives. In the minutes before I finally reached for that portfolio, I sat with a strange, quiet clarity I want to try to describe honestly, because I think it matters to understanding why I handled the rest of it the way I did. I was not thinking about her job, or her reputation, or what consequences she might eventually face. I was thinking about Tyler's face in the exact second her hand closed around his device, the specific way his eyes had gone wide and then instantly, heartbreakingly, resigned, like some small part of him had already expected the world to do this to him eventually and was simply confirming it. I was thinking about every appointment with Dr. Aluwalia, every session with Miss Angela on our living room floor, every late night spent troubleshooting software updates so his voice would sound a little more like the voice he wanted. All of it distilled down into one careless, entitled yank of a strap on a crowded airplane. I decided, somewhere over the Rockies, watching the mountains rise up gray and jagged beneath the wing, that I was done being quiet about the wrong things and calm about the right ones. The calm would stay. The quiet, when it came to protecting my son, was over. I reached into the small leather portfolio I keep in my carry-on, the one Tyler is under strict instructions never to touch because it holds mommy's work things, and I pulled out a single laminated card. I didn't hand it to her. Not yet. I placed it, face down, on my tray table, and I let it sit there while the seatbelt sign chimed on for our descent. She noticed it. Of course she noticed it. She had spent the entire flight noticing everything about our row except the actual human beings sitting in it. "What's that?" she asked, trying to sound casual, failing completely. I reached over and turned it face up. I placed it on the tray table. She looked down at it. And for the first time since she had boarded this flight, she went completely silent. Her eyes moved across the words on that card slowly, like she was reading them in a language she only half understood, and I watched her go through it exactly the way people always do, in the exact order I had seen 100 times before in 100 different rooms. Confusion first, her eyebrows pulling together like the words simply didn't compute. Then disbelief, a short, disbelieving laugh escaping her. The kind of sound people make when their brain is actively rejecting information. Then recognition, slower this time, her eyes flicking up to my face and back down to the card, comparing what she was seeing against everything she'd assumed about the exhausted, quietly dressed mother she'd spent the last 2 hours humiliating. And then, finally, panic. "You're—" she started and stopped. Marcus, standing in the aisle now with the kind of stillness crew members only have when they've been fully briefed, confirmed what the card already said without me needing to speak a single word. "Ma'am," he said to her, gently but with an edge underneath it now. "This is Director Donovan. She's the director of a federal division. The captain has already been in contact with ground authorities about the incident with the child's device." The color left her face in a way I have genuinely never seen happen to another adult human being that fast. Every ounce of her performance, all that entitled certainty she'd been wearing like armor for 2 straight hours, simply evaporated, leaving behind something small and scrambling and afraid. I wasn't trying to. "He's fine, isn't he? It's just a toy. I didn't actually hurt him." "He has a red mark on his neck from the strap you broke," I said, and my voice still did not rise, and that was somehow worse than any shouting could ever have been. "And he hasn't been able to communicate a single reliable word since you took his voice away from him." She looked around the cabin then, searching for the sympathetic audience she'd assumed was still there, and found instead 40 or 50 strangers looking back at her with an expression I can only describe as the collective, silent verdict of a jury that had already made up its mind. Deborah wasn't even bothering to hide her satisfaction anymore. The man with the New York voice had actually pulled out his phone, filming now, quietly narrating under his breath. "Oh, this is going on the internet." Even the man in the Carolina Panthers cap, who hadn't said a word the entire flight, was shaking his head slowly, arms crossed, watching her unravel. I want to speak to someone, she said, her voice climbing back up, panic replacing entitlement in exactly the same register. I have rights. You can't just... This is harassment. This whole thing is... Ma'am, Marcus said, his voice now carrying an authority I hadn't heard from him the entire flight. Please remain seated until we've landed. Denver PD will be meeting the aircraft at the gate. That's when the fear became complete. We touched down in Denver 11 minutes later, and I want to walk you through exactly what happened next, one piece at a time, because every single piece of it mattered, and every single piece of it was earned. The captain's voice came over the intercom as we taxied to the gate, unusually direct for a commercial flight. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We have a situation requiring law enforcement assistance before general deplaning can begin. Thank you for your patience. A murmur moved through the cabin. Dozens of people who had spent the entire flight only half aware of what happened in row 12 now realizing something significant was unfolding right in front of them. Phones coming out up and down the aisle, quiet questions passing row to row. 2 Denver police officers boarded first, along with a supervisor from the airline, and Marcus led them directly to our row without a word of confusion or hesitation, because the report had already gone ahead of us through the cockpit radio during our descent. She sat frozen in 12A, her $400 athleisure suddenly looking like a costume on a person shrinking inside it, and when the first officer addressed her by name, pulled straight from the passenger manifest, she flinched like she'd been slapped. "Ma'am, we need you to come with us," the officer said, a tall man with a calm, procedural tone that somehow made everything feel more official and more final than any amount of shouting could have. "We have a report of an altercation involving a minor, and we'll need a statement from you regarding an item taken from the child without consent." "This is insane," she said, and I heard the tremor underneath the outrage now, the sound of someone watching consequences arrive in real time for the first time in what was clearly a very long pattern of getting away with things. "It was an accident. I barely even touched it. Ask anyone." "Ma'am," Deborah called out, unprompted, still standing near our row. "I watched the whole thing. You yanked that boy's machine right off his neck and told his mother to keep him at home." "I'll give a statement too," happily. 2 other passengers immediately volunteered the same, the man with the New York accent holding up his phone, the video already recorded, time-stamped, undeniable. Even Priya, standing near the galley, quietly told the second officer that she'd witnessed the initial interaction and would be documenting it in the incident report she was required to file. She turned to me then, something desperate entering her voice for the first time. "Please," she said. "I have a job. I have a family. This could ruin everything. Can't we work something out?" I looked at her for a long moment, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel in that moment. Not triumph, not even satisfaction exactly, but a kind of tired clarity. "You had a chance to work something out," I said quietly. "It was when you had my son's voice in your hand and I asked you, calmly, to give it back. You made your choice then. This is just what happens after." The officers walked her off the plane in front of every single passenger in that cabin, her carry-on left behind for airline staff to handle. Her face streaked with the kind of tears that only show up once someone realizes their audience has completely turned. As she passed our row, she tried one last time, voice small and pleading, "I'm sorry. Okay? I'm sorry. Please don't do this." I didn't answer with anger. I didn't need to. I simply looked at her and said the only thing that mattered, calm and final. "It's not me doing this to you. This is just what happens when you decide a child's voice is disposable." Once she was off the aircraft, the 2 officers remained near the jet bridge doorway to take statements while the rest of us were finally allowed to deplane in the ordinary way, row by row, and I want to tell you about that walk up the aisle because it stayed with me longer than almost anything else that day. As we passed each row, people reached out. Not to stop us, not to make a scene, just small quiet gestures. A woman touched Tyler's shoulder gently and said, "You're a very brave young man." An older gentleman in a golf polo told me, "Ma'am, whatever you do for a living, thank you for doing it." Deborah hugged me before we even reached the jet bridge, unprompted, fierce and brief, and whispered in my ear, "You did exactly right, honey, exactly right." At the gate, an airline representative named Sandra was already waiting with a clipboard and an expression of barely contained mortification. And she began apologizing before I'd even fully stepped off the jet bridge. She explained that the incident had already been flagged as a priority case given the combination of a minor, an assistive medical device, and the confirmed identity of a federal official, and that the airline wanted to resolve every aspect of it as quickly and thoroughly as possible. She asked permission to photograph the mark on Tyler's neck for the incident file, gently and with real care, kneeling down to his eye level first and asking him directly if that would be okay, waiting for him to nod before doing anything at all. A small gesture that told me she understood, at least in that moment, that Tyler was a person to be asked, not a case to be processed. I confirmed the report I wanted filed, the same one I would have filed for anyone's child, not just my own, because I have sat across the table from too many people in my career who only faced consequences because someone with power decided to make noise on behalf of someone without it, and I was not about to become a person who only fought for justice when it happened to walk directly into my own row. I gave my statement. I provided Marcus and Priya's names for the record, along with Deborah's, and the man with the New York accent, whose name turned out to be Anthony, and the young man with the Midwestern voice, whose name was Caleb, all of whom stayed behind at the gate longer than they needed to simply to make sure their statements were properly recorded. While Sandra finished her paperwork at the gate, I stepped a few feet away and called Mark, who had stayed behind in Charlotte for a work deadline and was planning to fly out 2 days later. He picked up on the first ring, the way he always does when he's anxious, and I could hear him moving around our kitchen, the specific clink of him setting down a coffee mug too hard on the counter. I told him what happened, as evenly as I could manage, watching Tyler over my shoulder the whole time, watching him sit calmly in a gate area chair pressing buttons on his new device just to hear it work again. Mark went quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line, and then he said, in a voice that cracked slightly in the middle, "Is he okay? Is our son okay?" I told him yes, that Tyler was shaken but safe, that the mark on his neck was already fading, that the new device had arrived and was working perfectly. Mark exhaled, long and shaky, and then he asked the question I knew was coming. The question every parent asks when they hear their child was hurt and they weren't there to stop it. "What did you do?" he asked. Not accusing, just needing to know. I told him the truth, that I stayed calm, that I let the situation unfold the way it needed to unfold, that I hadn't raised my voice once. He laughed, a small surprised huff of a laugh, and said, "Of course you didn't. You never do. That's always been the scariest thing about you, Ratch." I told him I loved him, and that I'd send him the incident report number once it was finalized, and that I'd call again once we got to the hospice room. He told me to hug his father-in-law for him, and to tell Tyler that Daddy was proud of him, so proud, and that he'd see them both soon. The terminal, once we finally made it off the jet bridge and into the gate area, was its own strange kind of aftermath. Word of what had happened on the flight had somehow already reached a small cluster of gate agents and ground crew before we'd even reached the counter, the specific speed with which stories travel through an airport staff the moment something notable happens on an inbound aircraft. A woman in an airline vest approached me almost immediately, introducing herself as the station's customer service manager, and asked, with real concern in her voice, whether Tyler needed anything: water, a quiet space away from the crowd, a snack from the employee break room if the vending machines weren't appealing. Tyler, worn down from the adrenaline finally draining out of his small body, pressed a button on his flickering old device, and it managed, just barely, to produce one final phrase before it gave out completely. "I am tired." The woman's face crumpled with something like genuine grief at hearing that, and she knelt down in front of him at his eye level and told him he'd been so brave, so incredibly brave, and that everyone at the airline was going to make sure he had everything he needed. I sat with Tyler in a quiet corner near a shuttered kiosk while the police finished processing statements from the other passengers who had chosen to stay behind, and I watched, from a distance, as Deborah gave her account to the second officer with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had clearly given statements to police before and had no patience for anyone softening the truth for anybody's comfort. I watched Anthony hand over his phone so the footage could be properly logged into the report, watched him wait patiently while an officer copied the file, watched him shake the officer's hand afterward like he'd just finished a job he took seriously. I watched Caleb, the quiet young man with the Midwestern voice, linger near the gate longer than he needed to, clearly wanting to make sure Tyler was truly all right before he let himself head toward baggage claim. It was nearly 45 minutes before Sandra, the airline's family liaison, found us in that quiet corner out of breath, carrying a slim folder and the box containing Tyler's replacement device, which she had personally expedited through what she described as every favor I had left to call in. She sat down across from us on a low airport bench, and before she said anything about paperwork or procedure, she looked directly at Tyler and asked him, gently, if it would be all right if she talked to his mom for a minute. He nodded, already reaching for the box in her hands with the particular hope of a child who has just been told something good might finally be happening. Sandra explained, quietly and thoroughly, everything the airline intended to do, the full and immediate replacement of the damaged device at no cost, a formal letter of apology that would be sent to our home within the week, coverage of any medical follow-up related to the mark on Tyler's neck, and a direct line to her personal cell phone in case anything else came up in the following weeks that needed the airline's attention. She told me, almost as an aside, that she had 2 nephews on the spectrum herself, and that stories like ours were the reason she'd taken this particular job in the first place, the reason she stayed in it even on the days when the job asked more of her than it gave back. I believed her. There was nothing performative in the way she said it. And by the time we reached my father's hospice room that evening, Tyler had a brand new device loaded with his exact vocabulary, delivered by an airline representative who apologized so many times I eventually had to tell her it was all right, that Tyler forgave people fast even when the world was slow to earn it. The device arrived at our hotel just after 8 that night, hand-delivered by a courier the airline had arranged, still warm from its packaging. Every setting already transferred from a backup file the airline's disability services coordinator had located through Miss Angela's office within a matter of hours. I remember standing in that hotel room doorway, signing for the package, and feeling something in my chest finally loosen for the first time since the plane. That's when the cabin, once she was gone, did something I will never forget. People clapped. Not wildly, not for show. A quiet, rolling, genuine round of applause, the specific sound of a group of strangers who had all silently agreed on something important and were finally allowed to say so out loud. The gray-haired woman reached across the aisle and squeezed my hand. The young man with the Midwestern voice leaned over and told Tyler, gently, "You did great, buddy. You were so brave." And Tyler, who still couldn't fully speak through his cracked device, simply smiled that enormous gap-toothed smile of his, and I watched half the row melt on the spot. That's when I laughed once, unexpectedly. A real laugh pulled out of me by the sheer relief of watching my son's smile return to his face, and it surprised me as much as anyone. This small bright sound escaping in the middle of everything else that had happened. The applause didn't stop right away either. It kept rolling in small waves as we gathered our things. A woman too rose up mouthing "thank you" at me across the aisle. The man in the Carolina Panthers cap giving Tyler a slow, solemn nod like he was saluting a fellow soldier. Even the pilot, once we'd finally taxied fully to the gate, stepped briefly out of the cockpit before general deplaning began, walked the short distance down the aisle and crouched in front of Tyler's seat. "I heard you had a rough flight, buddy," he said. "But I also heard you were about the bravest passenger on this whole plane." Tyler, his new device not yet arrived, could only smile in response, but the pilot seemed to understand that smile perfectly well, reaching out to shake his small hand like he was shaking the hand of someone 20 times his age. My father, thin and tired but still entirely himself, watched Tyler press a button on his new device the moment we walked into that hospice room, and the little robotic voice, careful and specific and completely his, said the words Tyler had been saving for this exact moment since we boarded that plane that morning. "Hi, Grandpa. I love you." My father cried. I cried again, the second time that day, though this time it had nothing to do with fear. We stayed in that room for almost 2 hours, past visiting hours, past the point where the nurses would normally have asked us to leave, because one of them had heard what happened on the flight through a call from the airline's family liaison and quietly told her supervisor to let us be. Tyler showed my father his rock collection, laying each stone out on the hospital blanket one by one, and my father, with what little strength he had left, picked up each one and asked Tyler a question about it through slow, careful nods, and Tyler answered every single one through his device, patient and delighted, teaching his grandfather his entire private system of weight and color and shape that had taken years to develop and that he had never before had the chance to fully explain to someone who wanted so badly simply to listen. My father asked me, once Tyler had drifted off to sleep in the recliner beside the bed, worn out from the longest and hardest day of his young life, what had actually happened on that plane. I told him the short version first, the version I'd given Mark, and he listened with his eyes closed, his breathing slow and effortful in the way it had become over the last several weeks. When I finished, he was quiet for a while, long enough that I thought he might have drifted off too. Then he opened his eyes and said, in a voice thinner than I remembered from even a month before, "You know, when you were 7, some kid at your school called you slow because you had a stutter for about a year. Do you remember that?" I told him I didn't, not really, just fragments. "I went up to that school," he said, "and I didn't yell at anybody. I just sat across from that boy's father in the principal's office and I asked him, real quiet, whether he'd like his son to grow up thinking cruelty was an acceptable substitute for patience. You get that from somewhere, you know, the quiet part. You didn't invent it." I hadn't known that story. 38 years old and hearing, for the first time, where some piece of myself had actually come from. I sat with that for a long while after he fell asleep for real, watching the slow rise and fall of the blanket over his chest, watching Tyler's small chest rising and falling in the recliner beside him. 3 generations of the same stubborn, quiet refusal to let cruelty go unanswered, sitting together in one dim hospice room in Denver while a nurse checked vitals in the hallway and the rest of the world went on completely unaware. We visited every day for the 11 days we stayed in Denver, and each day Tyler brought something new to show his grandfather. A drawing, a fact about dinosaurs he'd learned from a book Priya had recommended over email after the flight, a new phrase he'd added to his device just so he could say it out loud to someone who had waited his whole life, in some sense, to hear it. My father passed away 6 weeks after we returned home to Charlotte, peacefully, in his sleep, with a hospice nurse who told us afterward that in his last conscious hours he had asked her, more than once, whether the boy with the rocks was coming back soon. I like to think some part of him already knew the answer was yes, that Tyler would carry a piece of those 11 days with him for the rest of his life, the way I now carry that story about the stuttering 7-year-old and the quiet father who went to bat for her without ever raising his voice. I never found out every single detail of what happened to her afterward, but I learned enough through the official channels available to me over the following weeks. The assault charge was upheld after review, along with a separate charge related to the destruction of assistive medical property, both of which carry real and lasting legal consequences regardless of a person's income or social standing. She lost her job 2 weeks later after her employer, a regional insurance company based out of Charlotte, received calls from 3 different news outlets asking for comment on video footage that had, by then, been viewed several million times across multiple platforms, viewers from every state weighing in with the particular fury reserved for anyone who has ever watched a child be humiliated in public. She was also, I later confirmed through a passing conversation with the investigating officer, quietly looked into for a pattern of similar complaints on other flights, filed by other exhausted parents and caregivers who had simply never had the specific set of circumstances required to make the world finally listen the way it listened that day. In the weeks that followed, I learned more of the details than I ever expected to, mostly because the case took on a life of its own once Anthony's video made its way from a small aviation forum onto larger platforms, then onto local news in Charlotte and Denver, then, within about 10 days, onto a national morning show that ran a segment on assistive communication devices and the families who depend on them. I was not the one who sent that video anywhere. Anthony did that entirely on his own, and when a producer eventually reached out to me for comment, I declined to appear on camera, both because of the nature of my job and because I did not want Tyler's face turned into a symbol for anything. I only agreed to a short written statement, which the network read aloud instead. Every child deserves to be heard. I hope this reminds people that a communication device is not a toy. It is a voice, and it deserves the same respect as anyone else's. Each consequence arrived separately over the following weeks, and each one landed with its own specific weight. The way a verdict is always more powerful when it's read one count at a time instead of all at once. First came the airline's internal notice, delivered through her own airline account before she'd even collected her luggage from baggage claim, informing her that her frequent flyer status had been suspended pending review. Then came the formal ban a few days later, permanent, covering every subsidiary and partner carrier in the airline's network, a detail that meant she would need to fly other airlines for the rest of her life if she ever wanted to board a plane again. Then came the criminal charges, formally filed, requiring an actual court appearance in Denver rather than the quiet citation her attorney had initially hoped for. Then came the news coverage, and with it, the loss of her job. Then came the quiet, almost anticlimactic final piece, the discovery, buried in a routine background check her own defense attorney had run to prepare for trial, that 2 prior airlines had informal notes in their customer service systems documenting strikingly similar complaints against her, complaints that had never before been connected to each other because no single incident had ever generated enough attention to make anyone go looking for a pattern. The legal process moved the way these things move, slower than television makes it look, but steadily. Her attorney initially pushed for the charges to be reduced to a simple citation, arguing the destruction of the device was unintentional and the injury to Tyler's neck was minor and not permanent. The district attorney's office in Colorado, after reviewing Anthony's footage alongside written statements from Deborah, Caleb, Marcus, and Priya, declined to reduce the charges, citing what the filing described as a clear pattern of escalating, deliberate conduct directed at a minor with a documented disability. I was asked, at one point, whether I wanted to pursue additional civil action on Tyler's behalf, given the cost of the original device and what his therapist described in a supporting letter as a temporary but real regression in his confidence using it. I told the attorney handling that conversation that I didn't want a settlement. I wanted the record to exist clearly and permanently, so that the next parent this happened to would have something to point to. She lost her job 2 weeks later after her employer, a regional insurance company based out of Charlotte, received calls from 3 different news outlets asking for comment on video footage that had, by then, been viewed several million times across multiple platforms, viewers from every state weighing in with the particular fury reserved for anyone who has ever watched a child be humiliated in public. Her employer's statement, brief and carefully worded, noted only that the company held all employees to a standard of conduct consistent with its values, and that her position had been terminated effective immediately. She was also, I later confirmed through a passing conversation with the investigating officer, quietly looked into for a pattern of similar complaints on other flights, filed by other exhausted parents and caregivers who had simply never had the specific set of circumstances required to make the world finally listen the way it listened that day. One of those parents, a mother from Ohio who had experienced something disturbingly similar on a flight the previous year involving her daughter's hearing aid, reached out to me directly through a mutual connection at a disability advocacy organization, just to say thank you, just to say that watching the video had made her feel, for the first time, like someone believed her. I exchanged contact information with a few of the passengers before we finally parted ways at baggage claim, mostly at their insistence rather than mine, and over the following months I learned a little more about who they were outside of that airplane. Deborah, it turned out, was a retired school administrator from Gastonia, on her way to Denver to help her daughter with a new baby, and she told me over the phone a few weeks later that she'd spent 31 years running a public elementary school and had seen every version of that woman walk through my office door demanding I punish some other kid for their kid's problems. She said watching Karen behave that way on the plane had felt less like witnessing something shocking and more like watching a rerun of the worst parts of her old job, except this time she no longer had to worry about budget committees or re-election politics before she said what needed saying. "Retirement's given me my mouth back," she told me, laughing. "I plan to use it. I think about the passengers on that flight more than I think about her, honestly. I think about Deborah, who stood up in the aisle without being asked to. I think about Anthony, who filmed not for clout but because some instinct told him the truth deserved a record. He told me later, over a brief phone call arranged through the airline's incident file, that he worked as a paralegal in Brooklyn and had simply developed a professional reflex for documenting things the moment they started to look like they might matter later. "I wasn't trying to make anything go viral," he said. "I was trying to make sure that if anybody asked what happened, there'd be an answer nobody could argue with." He never asked for anything in return, not credit, not a mention, and when the video did eventually spread far beyond what either of us expected, he seemed almost embarrassed by the attention, more interested in whether Tyler was doing all right than in any of the comments piling up under his post. I think about Caleb, quiet and Midwestern and completely unwilling to let a small boy be humiliated without saying something. He was 29, flying home to Omaha from a work conference, and he told me a little sheepishly that speaking up like that wasn't something that came naturally to him at all, that he'd actually sat with his hands shaking in his lap for a full minute working up the nerve before he finally said anything. I kept thinking, if that were my nephew, I'd want somebody on that plane to say something, he told me. So I just made myself be that somebody, even though every instinct in me wanted to stay quiet and let somebody else handle it. I think about how much courage that kind of quiet, uncertain bravery actually requires, more sometimes than the loud, confident kind, because it comes from someone who has to talk themselves into it first. I think about Marcus and Priya, professional and careful and clearly rattled, doing their jobs with more grace than anyone could reasonably expect under that kind of pressure. Justice, in the end, is rarely the work of one person standing alone. It's the work of an entire cabin deciding, together, in the space of about 90 minutes, that a 7-year-old's silence was worth more than one adult's comfort. When we finally flew home to Charlotte after those 11 days in Denver, on a different airline entirely because I could not bring myself to book us back onto the same carrier so soon, Tyler's school had somehow already heard the story, the way small communities do, through a parent who'd seen the news segment and recognized our last name from the class directory. Ms. Ruiz met us at drop-off on Tyler's first day back with a hand-drawn poster the whole class had made, covered in crayon rocks and crayon airplanes, and, at the center, a crayon microphone with the words "Tyler's Voice Matters," written in a first grader's careful, uneven handwriting. Owen and Marcus, his two best friends, had apparently spent an entire afternoon arguing over whose turn it was to hold the marker for that particular line, a detail Ms. Ruiz relayed to me with the kind of gentle amusement that made me want to cry for an entirely different reason than I had been crying for the past 2 weeks. The school counselor asked whether it might help for her to speak briefly with Tyler's class about communication devices in general, not singling out what had happened to him specifically, just using it as an opening to talk about the many different ways people talk to each other. I agreed, cautiously, wanting to protect him from ever feeling like a lesson plan built out of his own trauma. And Ms. Ruiz assured me the approach would center entirely on curiosity and respect rather than pity. A week later, Tyler came home and, completely unprompted, pressed a new phrase on his device that he'd apparently built himself during free choice time with the class computer, grinning the entire time he showed me. Owen learned my talking machine words too. That detail matters more to me, in some ways, than anything that happened to her afterward. Because that is the actual antidote to what happened on that plane. Not punishment delivered to one cruel stranger, but curiosity cultivated in an entire classroom of 7-year-olds who decided, on their own, that learning a friend's language was worth the effort. Karen, whoever she becomes next, whatever she learns or doesn't learn from what happened to her, is ultimately a footnote in this story. Owen learning Tyler's words is the actual point. Tyler is 9 now. He still collects rocks. He still hums when he's happy, and I have built my entire life around protecting that sound. His device today holds over 4,000 words, and somewhere in there, buried in a folder he built himself with his speech therapist, is a phrase he added a few months after that flight, one he presses sometimes completely unprompted, usually right before we board a plane. I have a voice. It matters. Mark flew out 2 days later, exactly as planned, and I remember watching him walk through the arrivals gate at Denver International, scanning the crowd until his eyes found Tyler, who was holding up his new device with both hands like a trophy, already waiting to show his dad every new phrase he'd added in the time they'd been apart. Mark dropped to his knees right there in the middle of the terminal, pulling Tyler into a hug so tight I worried for a second it might actually hurt, and over Tyler's shoulder he mouthed the words "thank you" at me, not for anything specific, just for all of it, for getting our son through the worst afternoon of his short life and out the other side smiling. We didn't talk about the flight again in front of Tyler after that, not directly, though every so often over the following months Mark would reach over during a quiet moment at dinner and squeeze my hand for no apparent reason, and I always understood exactly what he meant by it without either of us needing to say a word. We fly to Denver every few months now until we no longer need to, and every single time, right at the gate, Tyler finds Deborah's contact photo in the small album of flight friends. I keep on my phone for him and presses the button beside it just to see her face again, humming the whole time because some connections, even brief ones, even ones forged in the middle of the worst afternoon of a child's life, turn out to matter more than you'd ever expect. People ask me sometimes, when this story comes up, whether I ever feel guilty about how thoroughly her life fell apart afterward. It's a fair question, and I've sat with it more than once, usually late at night when the house is quiet and I'm the only one awake. Here is the honest answer. I did not build her downfall. I did not orchestrate her firing or the news coverage or the charges filed against her. All I did was refuse to let the moment disappear the way it was clearly designed to disappear, the way so many moments like it disappear every single day, in the ordinary silence of a tired parent too depleted to fight, a caregiver too used to swallowing their anger, a child too young to understand that what just happened to him was wrong and worth fighting over. Every consequence she faced afterward, she built entirely on her own, one entitled decision at a time, stacked one on top of another until there was no longer any room left for anyone to look away. I think about the version of that day where I don't happen to work for the federal government, where I'm just an ordinary exhausted mother without a laminated card in a leather portfolio, and I want to be honest with you about that version too, because it matters more than the version where everything works out cleanly. In that version, I still would have asked her to give my son his voice back. I still would have stayed calm. I still would have documented everything, gotten names, insisted on a police report at the gate. The badge sped things along. The badge made a cabin full of strangers understand, in an instant, exactly how serious the situation was. But the badge did not create the courage it took for Deborah to stand up in that aisle, or for Anthony to start recording, or for Caleb to speak up from 2 rows back in a voice that clearly cost him something to use. Those were choices made by ordinary people who simply decided, in the moment it mattered, that comfort wasn't worth more than doing the right thing. That part of the story would have happened with or without me. I just happened to be lucky enough to also have the tools to make sure it stuck. I've thought a lot, too, about what it means to raise Tyler in a world that will, at some point, inevitably do this to him again. I cannot follow him onto every flight, into every classroom, across every parking lot and grocery store and birthday party for the rest of his life. There will be other people who look at his device and see an inconvenience instead of a voice. There will be other rooms where I am not standing beside him, where he will have to rely instead on whatever strangers happen to be nearby that day, whatever version of Deborah or Anthony or Caleb the universe puts in his path. That thought used to keep me awake more than almost anything else about his diagnosis. What comforts me now, strange as it sounds, is that flight. Not the cruelty of it, the response to it, because it proved something I needed to see with my own eyes, that when a child's dignity is genuinely on the line, most people, when actually given the chance, choose to defend it. Not all of them, not instantly, but enough. Enough that a cabin full of complete strangers turned, almost as one, against a woman who thought she had an audience, and discovered instead that she had a jury. Miss Angela tells me now, 3 years into working with Tyler, that one of the most important parts of her job isn't teaching a child which button says which word. It's teaching the world around that child that the words matter just as much when they come out of a machine as when they come out of a mouth. I didn't fully understand what she meant by that until I watched an entire airplane cabin decide, on their own, without anyone lecturing them about it, that my son's silence deserved the same protection as anyone else's voice. Tyler doesn't remember every detail of that flight anymore. Children are merciful that way, more merciful than most adults ever manage to be with their own painful memories. What he does remember, what he brings up sometimes completely out of nowhere, usually while sorting his rocks by the windowsill, is the applause. He remembers people clapping for him. He remembers Deborah's face and Caleb's voice, and the exact moment his grandfather heard him say, "I love you," for the very first time out loud. He has folded that day, somehow, into something closer to a good memory than a bad one, and I think that says more about the character of the strangers on that plane than it says about anything I did. If there is one thing I hope you take from this story, it's this. Every single person deserves to be heard, in whatever form their voice takes, and the measure of a stranger's character is never what they do when it's easy. It's what they're willing to say out loud when it isn't. And if you ever find yourself sitting near someone whose voice doesn't work the way yours does, whether it's a device hanging from a small boy's neck, a shaking hand trying to sign the word, help, or simply a person too exhausted or too afraid to speak up for themselves in that particular moment, I hope you remember this story. I hope you remember Deborah standing up in that aisle without being asked. I hope you remember Anthony quietly pressing record because some instinct told him the truth deserved a record, and Caleb working up the nerve with shaking hands to say something anyway. And I hope, when it's your turn, whenever and wherever that turn eventually comes, you stand up too, because somewhere on that flight, in a cabin full of strangers 37,000 feet above the ground, that's exactly what turned one small boy's worst afternoon into a memory he now, somehow, chooses to remember as good.